What if buying a bottle of water could turn your whole life upside down? In a quiet neighborhood store, a young black nurse walks in after work, calm, tired, just trying to get home. Minutes later, two officers arrive, hands raised, accusations fly. But what really happened, and who was watching when the truth was twisted? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Zariah Coleman stepped out of the nursing home's back door just as the sun dropped below the skyline. The air still held a hint of spring chill, brushing against her neck as she adjusted her white blouse. It had a faint antiseptic smell from the long shift, something she barely noticed anymore. Her hair was tied back neatly, and the small reading glasses that she only used for charts hung on a fabric cord, bouncing gently against her chest as she walked. Brookline Heights was a quiet pocket of Charlotte, the kind of neighborhood where front yards stayed trimmed and the same three dogs barked from the same fences every day. As Zariah made her way down the sidewalk, she checked the time on her phone, 6:07 p.m. Just enough time to grab a few things before heading home. The lights inside Quick Basket Market flickered as she approached, one of the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead. It wasn't her favorite place to shop, but it was close. She'd been there maybe 3 or 4 times. Enough to know where the water was, and that the clerks never smiled. As she stepped through the sliding door, the quiet hum of coolers and the clink of coins in the vending machine filled the space. A couple stood near the refrigerated section, whispering. A teenage boy hovered near the magazine rack. Everyone looked up for a moment when Zariah entered. Their eyes paused just a second too long before drifting away. She didn't think much of it. Not really. She was used to being looked at, especially in scrubs, especially here. Zariah went straight for the bottled water. She grabbed a small one, not cold. Then she moved to the shelf near the counter and picked out 2 protein bars. Nothing fancy, just something to keep her going before dinner later. As she stepped up to the register, she unzipped her wallet, an old brown leather one soft from use, and pulled out a few folded bills. Her nails were trimmed short, her fingers precise as she separated the crinkled 10s and 5s. She counted softly, just loud enough to hear herself think. Behind the counter stood a man she hadn't seen before. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, with pale skin and a baseball cap pulled low. His name tag said Troy. He didn't greet her, just stared, lips pressed tight. Zariah kept her focus on the bills. 1, 2, $7. That would cover it. Troy's hand slid beneath the counter. His thumb moved over the screen of a small phone. He kept looking at her, sharp, calculated, like he was watching for something. Then quietly into the phone. Quick Basket. We've got someone acting suspicious at the register. Female, black, might be hiding merchandise. He ended the call without looking away. Zariah didn't hear it. She was still checking her last dollar, the one with the corner torn. She hesitated, wondering if the machine would take it. She didn't notice Troy stiffen behind the counter or the small nod he gave to himself. Outside, traffic was light. A car passed, then another. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped. The door chimed as someone else left the store. Through the front window, the fading daylight caught the red and blue of a police cruiser as it slowed, then turned around. Zariah was placing her items on the counter when she noticed the shift in light, the faint reflection of flashing colors across the freezer glass. She looked up. A patrol car had pulled into the curb, engine idling, lights still blinking. Inside the store, the register beeped as it idled. Troy didn't move. Zariah blinked, confused, then looked over her shoulder toward the front. The car door opened, and from the cruiser, 2 officers stepped out, one adjusting his belt, the other already reaching for the radio clipped to his chest. Zariah's hand froze just above the counter, still holding that torn dollar. Her heart didn't race yet, just a flicker of alertness. But somewhere, in the part of her that had always been trained to stay calm, something started to shift. She looked back at Troy. He didn't say a word, didn't meet her eyes, just watched. And Zariah didn't feel like a nurse running errands after work. She felt like a stranger standing in the middle of a story she hadn't agreed to be part of. The door hadn't even finished closing behind the 2 officers when Zariah noticed how quiet the store had gotten. One moment, she was still holding the protein bars and the dollar with the torn corner. The next, there were footsteps, measured, heavy, crossing the linoleum floor behind her. She turned, expecting maybe someone from the neighborhood watch or a curious passerby. Instead, two uniformed officers stood just feet away. One was tall and wiry, the other broader with a flushed face and narrowed eyes. "Step away from the counter, ma'am," the taller one said, voice clipped. Zariah blinked, confused. "Excuse me." The shorter officer pointed at her bag. "We've received a call about a possible theft. We need you to place your hands where we can see them." "I... what?" "I'm buying water and snacks," Zariah said, still trying to process what was happening. She lifted her hands slightly, palms open, but didn't move from her spot. "You can check my stuff, but I haven't stolen anything." "We'll decide that," the taller one, Henley his badge said, snapped. "Hands against the wall. Now." Zoria took a half step back, eyes darting to Troy behind the counter. He avoided her gaze, pretending to organize receipts. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said again, her voice rising now, edged with panic. "You're making a mistake." The bigger officer, Marlowe, stepped forward. "You're not cooperating. If you resist, we'll detain you. We're not playing games." A sound rustled near the drinks cooler. A man in a hoodie, probably no older than 20, lifted his phone. He wasn't trying to hide it. He held it at chest level, recording everything. His expression was unreadable. Part curiosity, part unease, but he didn't say a word. Zuria's breathing quickened. The officers loomed closer now. Every inch of her body told her to stay still, to stay calm. This wasn't new, not completely. She'd heard the stories, seen the clips, but none of that had prepared her for what it felt like, being on the other side of suspicion, under a spotlight she didn't ask for. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'm a nurse. I just got off work. I have my ID in my bag. Please." Henley interrupted her, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "We don't need your life story. You were seen acting suspiciously. You're going to let us check your belongings or we'll do it for you." The moment stretched. Troy finally spoke, his voice a mumble. I thought she might have put something in her bag. I didn't see it clearly. Just..." She kept looking around. Zariah looked at him, stunned. Her mouth opened, then closed. There were no words for the betrayal sitting just behind her ribs. Someone coughed. Another person, an older man in a plaid shirt, stepped back, not wanting to get involved. The man with the phone kept filming, still silent. Outside, another patrol car rolled past slowly, but didn't stop. Inside, Marlowe reached for her shoulder. Before he could touch her, a sharp voice came through on the officers' radios, crackling through static. "Unit 3, what's the status at Quick Basket?" Henley responded. "Suspect is uncooperative. No physical resistance, but she's refusing to comply." A beat of silence, then a different voice, calm, firm, and unfamiliar, cut in. "What's the suspect's name?" "Zariah Coleman," Marlowe said, checking her hospital badge still clipped to her blouse. There was another pause, just a second too long. "Hold position," the voice said finally. "Do not escalate. I'm en route." The officers looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Behind the counter, Troy's hands trembled slightly as he turned off the scanner. His eyes flicked to Zariah, then back down. Miles away, at the Brookline precinct, Captain Morris Coleman stood frozen, one hand still resting on the dry erase board listing neighborhood patrol routes. The voice on the radio was his. He stared at the radio unit for a moment, then turned to the young officer standing beside him. "Get my car," he said quietly. "Now." As the officer moved, Morris exhaled once deeply. Then he grabbed his jacket and started walking. Back at Quick Basket, Zariah remained still. She looked around the store. The people pretending not to watch, the man recording with no intention of helping, the cashier who didn't know how to take back what he'd already set in motion. And then she looked at the two officers again. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was done trying to explain herself to people who didn't want to listen. She straightened her back. "I'm not moving," she said. Outside, a black SUV turned the corner, lights off but pace steady. Inside, the air felt like it had stopped moving. Zariah stood in the same spot, her feet planted like they'd grown roots into the tile. The torn dollar was still crumpled in her hand. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Not from fear exactly, but from the sting of being misunderstood in public, of being turned into something she wasn't. Again. Officer Henley took a step forward. His fingers hovered near the strap of his utility belt. "Last chance," he said. "Open the bag or we open it ourselves." Zariah blinked slowly, her voice low and even. "I want the store manager here. I'm not giving you anything unless someone else witnesses this." "You don't get to make demands," Officer Marlowe snapped, already moving toward her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch. "I know my rights. I'm not resisting. I just want—" Before she could finish, Marlowe reached for her bag. Not cautiously, not respectfully. He yanked it hard enough to pull the strap off her shoulder, and the contents scattered across the floor like someone had opened a suitcase mid-flight. The first thing to hit the ground was her hospital ID, then her stethoscope, tangled with a small bottle of hand sanitizer. A folded-up patient care chart fell open, revealing careful handwriting, vitals, shift notes, initials. Her wallet hit next, splaying open to show her license, three $20 bills, and a receipt from the gas station earlier that week. It was quiet for a beat, like the store had taken a breath and was holding it. Then someone gasped. Zariah stared down at the mess on the floor, her mouth slightly open. There it was, her professional life, her proof of purpose, reduced to a pile of objects treated like contraband. Officer Henley bent slightly, poking at the wallet with a gloved finger. "No merchandise," he muttered. Zariah didn't say anything. She just looked at them both, Henley and Marlowe, and felt something burn through her chest. Not just shame, it was sharper than that. A feeling that twisted up behind her ribs and made her want to scream. Not out of fear, but from something deeper, something that had been building over years. Behind them, Troy finally cleared his throat. I didn't mean, I thought maybe she—" "You thought wrong," came a voice from near the freezer aisle. Everyone turned. A woman with gray hair dressed in a lavender cardigan stood with a bag of frozen peas in one hand and a quiet kind of anger on her face. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "I saw the whole thing. That young lady never touched a thing that wasn't hers. All she did was count her money." Henley turned toward her. "Ma'am, we're handling this." "You're handling it wrong," she cut in. At that, the man who had been recording the whole time slid his phone into his jacket pocket and walked toward the exit. Not in a hurry, just quiet and deliberate. Once outside, he leaned against the wall of the store, tapped his screen a few times, and hit upload. A title popped up under his fingers. "Black Nurse Humiliated by Cops for Counting Money." Inside, Zariah crouched slowly, gathering her things. Her hands trembled, not because she was scared, but because everything in her wanted to disappear. There was no dignity in picking up pieces of yourself while strangers watched. She slipped her ID back into the bag, placed the stethoscope on top, and zipped it up without a word. Henley stepped back, shifting uncomfortably. Even Marlowe looked uncertain now, his voice losing some of its edge. Zariah stood again, back straight. "You embarrassed me." "For what?" she said, her voice still low but steady now. "Because I paid in cash? Because of how I look? You never even asked." Henley didn't answer. Neither did Marlowe. Troy looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. Outside, the buzz of a phone rang out. A teenager glanced down and whispered something to his friend. Within minutes, the clip began to spread. Back at the Brookline precinct, Morris Coleman was walking out of the back office when a junior officer waved him down. "Sir, you might want to hear this. Dispatch just confirmed a report from Quick Basket. They said it's a nurse named Zariah Coleman. Said she's refusing to comply." Morris froze. The name hit him like a cold splash of water. He didn't ask any more questions. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Don't touch anything. Don't move her. I'm 5 minutes away." Then he grabbed his keys and left without another word. Back in the store, Zariah stood under the harsh glow of the overhead lights. Her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice had found its footing. She wasn't trembling now. "I want your badge numbers," she said to both officers, her tone still calm, still composed. And this time, nobody told her to be quiet. Zariah sat stiffly on the cold plastic chair near the entrance of Quick Basket. Her bag rested on her lap, both arms folded tightly over it like she was bracing for something. Not a physical blow, but the emotional collapse she was trying to keep at bay. She stared ahead, but her eyes didn't settle on anything. Her mind was too full, too loud. Officer Henley stood a few feet away, flipping his pen between his fingers, with a kind of impatience that wasn't even masked. Every so often he would glance at her, not with curiosity, but calculation, like he was still trying to fit her into the version of the story that made sense in his head. Marlowe leaned against the candy shelf, arms crossed. He hadn't said much, but he hadn't looked comfortable either. That didn't make him innocent, just quieter. Henley stepped toward her, clipboard in hand. His tone was clipped, tired. "Ma'am, I need your signature here. Standard field acknowledgement. It just shows you complied." Zariah didn't move. Her voice was soft but clear. "I didn't comply." Henley's jaw ticked. "You're refusing." "I'm refusing to say I did something I didn't," she said. "I didn't cause a problem. I didn't break the law. And I'm not signing anything that says I needed to be checked in the first place." Henley muttered something under his breath and turned, pressing his shoulder mic. Zariah didn't care what he said. Not anymore. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the older woman in the lavender sweater had crept a little closer. She was parked at the end of the soup aisle now, arms folded like a mother waiting for a teacher to explain why her child had come home crying. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left Zariah. A few more customers had wandered in, looked around, then made quiet exits, like they knew they'd walked into something they didn't want to witness, but couldn't unsee either. Zariah could feel the pressure around her shifting, not quite support, not yet, but unease. The kind of tension that builds when people start to realize they're watching something they'll have to remember. Henley returned to the radio, speaking low. "Need guidance. Suspect is refusing to sign cooperation form. Situation under control. No threats. Standing by." There was a pause, the familiar buzz of static. Then a voice came through, clipped, calm, unmistakable. "What's the name of the individual being detained?" Henley glanced at Zariah. "Your name, ma'am?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because everything in her life had taught her that names had power. Giving it, in this moment, felt like handing someone the pen to write her ending. But then something inside her, some last remnant of what was right in hers, rose up. "Zariah Coleman." Henley repeated it into the mic. The store seemed to freeze. Even the fridges at the back, humming all night long, sounded like they'd gone quiet for a beat. Then the voice returned. Same man, but different tone. "This is Captain Morris Coleman. Do not proceed. Secure the scene. I'll arrive in 3 minutes. No further actions are to be taken." Henley blinked like he hadn't quite heard right. Marlowe looked up from the shelf, brows lifted. "Captain said..." "Coleman." Henley clicked his mic again. Captain, did you say Coleman?" "Hold your position," Maurice replied, firmer now. "And if either of you lays another hand on her, I'll expect your resignation letters by sunset." Zariah didn't move. She didn't need to. Her heart was thudding against her ribcage, but her hand stayed steady in her lap. The officers looked unsure now. Henley suddenly fixated on the clipboard he'd tried to push earlier. Marlowe took a step back, like distance would undo what had just been said over the air. Troy behind the counter had started reorganizing gum packs that were already neat. It was all he could do to keep his fingers from shaking. Zariah stared at the counter's edge, at a small gouge in the laminate someone had carved years ago, probably with a key. She traced it lightly with her thumb. Somehow, that tiny imperfection in the furniture felt more honest than anything else in the room. She hadn't heard Morris's voice in over 2 weeks. Their last call had ended in frustration. No yelling, just the slow erosion of connection. He had been newly promoted, buried in meetings and press briefings. She had picked up extra shifts at the nursing home, too tired most nights to call. And now here they were, her sitting like a suspect in front of a half-empty gum rack. Him about to walk in as the man who could change everything. Zariah didn't cry. She didn't let her shoulders shake. But something shifted, broke loose inside. Not sadness, not anger. Finality. Like this moment had drawn a line through her life. Before and after. Henley turned to her, still tense. "Don't move." She said nothing, just kept her eyes on the door. Outside, headlights pulled into the lot, slow and deliberate. Inside, the air hung thick and uncertain. But Zariah wasn't uncertain anymore. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, stayed still, and she wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. She was taking up space, and that, all by itself, was power. The automatic door let out a soft whoosh as it slid open, letting in a rush of cool air and the faint sound of tires on asphalt. Nobody turned at first. The tension in the room had grown stale, the kind that made people forget to blink. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to quiet down, waiting. Maurice Coleman stepped into Quick Basket without ceremony. No uniform, no announcement. Just a simple black jacket zipped halfway, a badge clipped to his belt, and a face that looked like it had aged in the last 10 minutes. He scanned the room once, officers, cashier, bystanders, before his eyes found her. Zariah was sitting near the door, still gripping her bag like it was all she had left. Her shoulders hunched forward, not out of fear, but exhaustion. Her eyes stared at the floor, unblinking, like she'd locked herself somewhere deep inside. Maurice didn't say a word. He walked past the candy display, past Henley and Marlowe, who barely noticed him at first, too focused on their radios and each other. Troy glanced up from behind the counter, confused by the new arrival, then looked quickly away. Maurice stopped in front of Zariah. She looked up slowly, uncertain, not recognizing him at first. Then her eyes widened. Her lips parted just slightly. "Hey," he said, voice low. "You?" Her voice cracked on that single word. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. The room froze. Henley blinked. "Captain Coleman?" Marlowe looked from Maurice to Zariah, then back again. "Wait, what's going on?" Maurice turned around, his voice louder now but no less controlled. "The young woman sitting right here is Zariah Coleman. She's a nurse. She's not under arrest. And she also happens to be my sister." Henley shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Sir, we didn't know. We were just—" "You were just what?" Maurice's voice dropped again. "Humiliating her, accusing her, emptying her bag on the floor like she was shoplifting a bottle of water?" Troy stumbled backward a few steps, bumping into a cardboard stand of chips. He didn't say a word, just stared at the floor like it might offer a trap door out of this moment. Zariah slowly stood up. Her knees felt shaky, but she didn't want to sit anymore. Not when her brother was here, not when the people who had just embarrassed her were suddenly looking unsure of themselves. "I didn't even raise my voice," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I was polite. I just wanted to get a few things and go home." Maurice turned back to her, his face softening. "I know. I'm so sorry, Z." She shook her head. "It's not just today, Maurice. This happens. All the time. To people who don't have someone walking through the door for them." He swallowed hard. "Not anymore. Not if I can help it." Henley cleared his throat. "Captain, with respect, we followed protocol." Maurice turned to him slowly. "No, officer. You followed a feeling, a hunch, and you treated her like a suspect without cause. That's not protocol. That's profiling." No one argued with him. Behind the counter, Troy finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I just thought—" "She looked nervous. I didn't mean—" Maurice didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Troy the way a surgeon might look at a wound. Not with anger, but with cold precision. "You know how many people look nervous in the city? Being nervous isn't a crime. Being cautious isn't a confession." Troy nodded, eyes glassy. Zariah reached into her bag and slowly pulled out her stethoscope, holding it like a shield. "This is what I do," she said softly. "I take care of people. I hold the hands of strangers when their families can't be there. I clean up blood, change dressings, sit with the dying." She paused, blinking back tears. "But none of that mattered tonight. Not to them. Not to anyone in this room until you walked in." The store was silent. Even the cooler's hum seemed to fade for a moment. Maurice stepped closer and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "It matters now." She looked up at him again, and for a second, her face crumpled, not from weakness, but from the relief of being seen. Then she straightened. Morris turned back to the officers. I want your reports on my desk before end of shift. Both of you. And I'm putting you both on immediate administrative review. Henley opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. Outside, the parking lot was now dotted with people peering in. Word had spread fast. A few had their phones out. Someone was live streaming. Zariah turned toward the door. I want to go home now. Maurice nodded. I'll take you. She walked past the register without looking at Troy. She didn't need to say anything. Some shame carries its own weight. As the door slid open again and the night air wrapped around her, Zariah didn't feel proud. She didn't feel powerful. She felt tired. But she also felt like something had shifted, not just in the room, but in herself. Maurice stood in the center of Quick Basket, quiet but unshakable. The harsh lighting from the ceiling buzzed like static, but no one dared speak. The room, filled with frozen meals, soda displays, and snack shelves, had turned into something else entirely, an unplanned courtroom. And in that silence, everyone was waiting for a verdict. He scanned the space. The chip rack knocked sideways, a candy bar half squashed under someone's foot. Zariah's bag still unzipped, her ID badge barely visible. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sour, maybe guilt. Then Maurice spoke. His voice was low, but every syllable hit like it had been waiting all evening to land. This stops now. No more questions, no more commands. We wait here until internal affairs arrives. Nobody moves. Nobody touches another thing. Henley stiffened like someone had just insulted his training. He took one step forward, puffing his chest slightly. With all due respect, sir, this feels personal. Maurice didn't even blink. It became personal when my officers forgot they were public servants. Henley raised his voice a little. Captain, it's not about who she is to you. This isn't about family, it's about protocol. That's what we followed. Maurice stepped in closer, not aggressive, just firm. You didn't follow protocol. You followed your assumptions. You made a decision based on how she looked, not what she did. Henley opened his mouth again, voice rising now. So what? You want us to ignore suspicious behavior because someone's your... Finish that sentence, Maurice said, raising one hand. And you can hand me your badge right now. Henley froze. The tension in the air twisted tighter, like a wire pulled to the point of snapping. He looked around for support, but Marlowe had already stepped back half a pace, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the scuffed floor tiles. Maurice turned to both of them, voice sharp but even. You're both relieved of duty, effective immediately. Leave your service gear in your vehicles and wait for contact from the review office. I expect written reports by tomorrow morning. There were no protests, no loud exits, just silence, the kind that doesn't ask for understanding, the kind that demands it. Across the room, Zariah still hadn't moved. Her arms were folded tightly across her body, like she was holding in more than just frustration. Her eyes had a glassy sheen, but she wasn't crying. She was calculating. Each breath measured, every emotion kept on a leash. Slowly, she bent down. Her knees cracked softly, more from the pressure of the night than her posture. She picked up her stethoscope first, and then her shift notes, folded neatly like they had been hours earlier. Her pen had rolled under the shelf. She retrieved it without a word. When she stood, she didn't look at Maurice. She looked at the space, at the place where her dignity had been stepped over, doubted and nearly erased. Then she spoke. I don't need anyone's apology, she said quietly, but her voice cut through the silence like a chisel. I don't need pity either. I need the truth to matter more than what people assume when they look at me. She reached into her bag and pulled out the torn dollar bill, creased, still slightly damp from where it had fallen earlier. This is what started it. Me standing here, counting money like anybody else. But to him, she nodded at Troy. That looked suspicious. To them, she glanced toward the officers. That looked dangerous. Her hand curled around the bill slowly. I'm not a thief. I'm not a threat. I'm a nurse who came here after a long shift to buy a bottle of water and 2 protein bars. Troy looked visibly shaken now. He shifted behind the counter like the floor beneath him might give way. I don't need you to say you're sorry, she added, but you should think long and hard about what it means when your fear can rewrite someone else's story. For a moment, no one breathed. Then a voice spoke from the back. She's right. Heads turned. It was the older woman in the lavender cardigan. She stepped forward. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. Sure. We've been quiet too long, she said. Let too many things slide. You see it happen. You tell yourself it's not your business. I've done it. Not tonight. A murmur stirred through the room. A few nods. Then a man near the back, maybe in his 50s, with a ball cap and tired eyes, raised his hand slightly. She's a nurse, he said. Her name's Zariah, right? My mom's in room 108 at Heritage. You helped her eat applesauce when she was too weak to hold a spoon. Sat with her. Talked to her like she mattered. Zariah's eyes softened just a little. He stepped forward, voice clearer now. You didn't treat her like a patient. You treated her like a person. More voices trickled in. I saw the whole thing. She didn't take anything. You should post that video. Let people see it. Maurice didn't move. He just stood beside his sister. Not as her superior officer, not even as a captain. Just as someone who had seen the damage and wasn't willing to let it continue. Zariah took a slow breath. It filled her chest completely. Not because the system had changed, not because the world was suddenly better, but because, for once, people had seen clearly, and they didn't look away. The air inside Quick Basket had thickened into something unspoken, dense, heavy, expectant. You could feel it in the way people stood still, hands half raised toward forgotten shelves, eyes darting between Zariah, Maurice, and the two officers who now sat stiffly on overturned milk crates like kids caught misbehaving. Troy was frozen behind the counter. He hadn't moved since Maurice stepped in. His hands were tucked into his apron pockets, but his shoulders had caved in slightly, like a man who knew the weight of his own silence was about to land. Maurice stood tall, centered. His tone didn't rise, but it didn't need to. Security footage, he said. Pull it up. Troy blinked, caught off guard. I'm not sure if it's still saved. Sometimes the recordings cycle out after. Morris didn't break eye contact. He took a single step forward. Don't lie to me, Mr. Ellman. That system's motion triggered. It backs up to the cloud. You've had it running since the doors opened this morning. You know where it is. The silence that followed was longer than necessary. A few customers near the freezer aisle exchanged glances, unsure if they were watching justice or something worse. Troy hesitated. I think I might need permission from the owner. No, Maurice said, sharper now. You don't need permission. You need to do what's right. There was no raised voice, no threat, just a kind of finality, so certain that it left no room for negotiation. Troy swallowed and reached for the mouse. His hands trembled just slightly. With a few clicks, he opened the security console on the small screen behind the register. The timeline scrolled back, a few taps, then stillness. There she was. Zariah walking in through the automatic doors, alone, calm, composed. Her nurse scrubs still neat despite the long shift, her bag resting on one shoulder. She moved to the cooler, grabbed a water bottle, walked over to the snack rack, selected 2 protein bars. No hesitation, no rush, no looking over her shoulder. Then the money. On screen, she stepped up to the counter, opened her wallet, and began counting. Deliberate, precise. Nothing hidden, nothing out of place. She held the bills at eye level, flattening each one as she arranged them. There was nothing threatening, nothing suspicious. Just a woman paying for a few things after work. Maurice let the video run until Officers Henley and Marlowe entered the frame, their presence abrupt and authoritative. The posture, the body language, the tension, it was all there. Then Maurice lifted a hand. That's enough. The screen went black. The entire store was silent. No one moved. Zariah didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped forward, walking slowly until she stood just a few feet from Troy. The only sound was the soft thud of her boots on the tile. Troy couldn't look at her. I was raised to give people the benefit of the doubt, Zariah said, her voice clear, low. Even when it's hard, even when it hurts. That's what I do. Every single day. I sit with people when they're sick. I clean them when they can't clean themselves. I talk to them like they matter. Because they do. Troy's face flushed. His voice cracked. I didn't mean. I thought I saw. Zariah cut in. steady as steel. You didn't see anything. You saw my skin, and you decided that was enough. He looked down. I'm sorry, he mumbled. She gave one small nod. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Maurice stepped forward again, his voice now for the entire room. This incident, from start to finish, will be investigated. Officers Henley and Marlowe are placed on immediate administrative leave. Their conduct tonight will be reviewed for misconduct and racial profiling. Henley stirred slightly but didn't speak. Marlowe sat with his eyes on the floor, hands clenched between his knees. Maurice turned to Troy. Mr. Ellman, under municipal code, a false civilian report that results in wrongful detainment must be reviewed under both business and civil oversight. Effective immediately, you are suspended. A full inquiry will be conducted. Troy said nothing. His lips parted like he might object, but the words never came. Maurice's voice softened, turning back to Zariah. You should never have had to go through this, and I know that doesn't undo what happened, but you will be heard, and this will not be swept away. Zariah nodded faintly, though her eyes weren't on him. She was staring across the store at a crooked clock hanging above the refrigerated aisle. The ticking felt louder now. It hadn't changed, not once during this entire ordeal, and yet everything else had. Behind her a slow clap echoed. It was the older woman in the lavender cardigan, then another, and another. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was slow, gentle, a kind of reverence, not for drama, but for truth finally spoken out loud. Zariah didn't cry, didn't bow her head. She simply stood, quiet and still. It wasn't defiance, it was dignity. For the first time that night, she wasn't being responded to. She was being seen. And that, more than anything, was justice. It had only been a week, but in the life cycle of the internet, that might as well be a season. Still, the video hadn't faded. It had been clipped, captioned, dissected by local anchors and national talking heads alike. You could see Zariah, her hands calmly counting money, the confusion, the officers stepping in, her voice steady, Maurice entering, not with volume, but with weight. It had reached over 3 million views. The headlines were cautiously worded, Black nurse mistakenly detained in Charlotte store incident. Others were bolder, caught on camera, racial profiling in broad daylight. But what mattered more than the coverage was the response. Emails came in, messages, handwritten letters from old women in places Zariah had never been. Some from other nurses, others from strangers. One note, written in tight, careful cursive, simply said, You stood for all of us who've kept our heads down when we should have stood up. Zariah read them all. Some she reread more than once. But she didn't reply. Not because she didn't care, but because she was still figuring out what it meant to be seen in a way that wasn't pity, but power. It was a clear, warm morning when she sat across from Maurice at a cafe by the lake. The kind of spot that didn't rush you out and still used real sugar jars on the tables. Ducks glided silently on the water just beyond the window. The breeze carried the scent of spring and honeysuckle. Maurice stirred his coffee, but didn't drink it. His fingers tapped the side of the mug, like he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he sighed. I should have called, should have checked in sooner. I keep thinking, maybe if I had... Zariah didn't let him finish. You showed up, she said, and you listened. That's more than a lot of people ever get. He looked up at her, quiet, searching. She smiled, small but enough. You can't fix the world in one day, she said. But that day, you changed everything for me. She wrapped her hands around her mug, soaking in the warmth, then added more softly. What I learned isn't how to shout louder. It's how not to go silent when the truth's being bent. Morris gave a single nod, the kind that holds agreement and regret in equal measure. That'll stick, he said. It did. That afternoon, the neighborhood board held a public hearing. Officer Marlowe had already resigned, citing personal reflection. Henley was under review for prior complaints. Comments, it turned out, that had been ignored for too long. Then came Troy's letter. He hadn't spoken it himself. A nervous assistant from City Hall read it aloud, voice trembling. I called the police on a woman I didn't understand. I thought I saw something, but what I saw wasn't about her. It was about my own fear. I hope to learn from this, even if I never earn forgiveness. Zariah didn't attend the meeting. She sent a letter too. It was brief but direct. I'm not pressing charges, not because nothing happened, but because something did. And I want us to sit with that. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's refusing to carry someone else's mistake like it belongs to you. I hope Mr. Ellman means what he wrote, because second chances aren't owed. They're offered. When her letter was read, the room didn't erupt in applause. No speeches, just stillness. Not silence as avoidance, but silence as recognition. At Heritage Care, Zariah returned to her usual routines. The halls were the same, the scent of sanitizer, the creak of the floor near the nurse's station. But people moved differently now. Some co-workers gave her quiet nods. Others touched her shoulder gently in passing. One CNA whispered, "We're proud of you," as they passed in the break room. But Zariah didn't want to be famous. She wanted peace. She wanted her job back, her quiet evenings, her patience. And in time, that's exactly what she chose to reclaim. On a calm Tuesday, she stepped back into room 108, where sunlight stretched across the bedspread. The same room, the same cracked window latch, the same breathy hum of the oxygen machine. The older woman inside turned her head, eyes lighting up. "You're back," she whispered. Zariah smiled softly. "I never left." The woman reached out a trembling hand, fingers curling around Zariah's wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said, "not just for being a nurse, but for not letting them tear you down." Zariah blinked once. Then she squeezed her hand back. And in that moment, it wasn't the articles, or the meetings, or the headlines that lingered. It was the silence. Not the silence of shame, but the silence of something reclaimed. Dignity, truth, and the quiet, unshakable power of someone who refused to disappear. Sometimes injustice doesn't shout. It whispers in quiet decisions, in who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Zariah didn't raise her voice, but she stood her ground. And maybe that's the lesson. Strength doesn't always mean speaking louder. It means refusing to let silence rewrite the truth. What would you have done if you were there that day? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to follow the channel. There's more to come.